When you have like a corroborated source, what that means, by the way, is that you have independent sources that are not in communication with each other, but then just come to a conclusion from their observations. And then when you have multiple people that are observing the same thing, then it adds even more validity to what they observed, right? Just in another parking lot right now. Today we are talking about documentation, just in general, and how it pertains to the Bible. So just a quick little backstory about my background. I used to work in biotech, and in that field, documentation is everything. It's actually taken so seriously. And in that industry, if it wasn't signed and dated, then it didn't happen. That's according to record. Nothing is ever by word of mouth. Everything is written down. Everything is documented. And it's such a meticulous thing that every single step in your batch record, now batch records are basically a set of instructions. Every single tiny little step is documented, because if it wasn't documented, then it is safe to assume that it did not actually happen. And so documentation is so important. The reason I bring up documentation, and the reason I bring it up, is because when we're talking about the Bible, documentation is everything. And being able to verify written text is so important. And I think this is what is so interesting to me about the Bible, is that especially with those four main gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, what's interesting is that you have a lot of these eyewitnesses that were there with the disciples, that were there with Jesus, going through all of these different events, all of these different interactions with people. Jesus curing people of disease. It was documented. All the countless things that happened and that were eyewitness verified, right? And that was the other thing too, is that in biotech, the industry that I used to work in, not only was it important for a performer to sign and date the step in the batch record, but also just as important, if not even more important, is actually the verifier. So you generally will always work in pairs or more people, and someone who is qualified on that subject material is basically allowed to verify that, yes, in fact, that this person did perform this step, and they're watching you sign and date, right? And so a verifier will then also have to sign and date that they did verify said step. So this process of performing and verifying is actually such an important thing when we're talking about just documentation in general. And in the Bible, it's even more interesting to me because you actually have numerous amounts of verifiers, because you have many people that were eyewitnesses to a lot of these different acts. Countless acts. So many things. You have also a lot of corroborated pieces of information coming together that it would lead one to believe that a person like Jesus was in fact able to do a lot of these miraculous things. And it's because you have eyewitnesses from tons of different locations that had no form of communication amongst one another. That's what corroborated means, I'm pretty sure. When you have like a corroborated source, what that means, by the way, is that you have independent sources that are not in communication with each other, but then just come to a conclusion from their observations. And then when you have multiple people that are observing the same thing, then it adds even more validity to what they observed, right? You can't just have one person out of a batch of 10 people lie about what they've seen, because then it would be a complete mismatch and an outlier. But then what you see in the Bible is that you have a lot of these examples of corroborated things coming together to give you a validated source of that, yes, in fact, they did see a Jesus heal. They did, in fact, by even touching his garments, were able to get healed of some disease that they had. You know, this is what, it's these types of documentations that elevate the validity to such a level to where it's not just, this is why it's not fairy tales. This isn't just story time around a campfire. This is actually a form of documentation. And, you know, and that's why I bring up my science background, is because when I look at the Bible, this is what I see. I see that this is actually a it's like performed by and verified by piece of written work that has just been that's been approved by many people, by many officials and everything. And so that's why the Bible to me is such an interesting book. It's because of that reason alone. I mean, obviously there's going to be tons of information that's left out. And then there's also the issue of, you know, telephone, where the translations of text throughout the time slightly gets mistranslated, or, you know, there's definitely even just the language and the phrasing and the specific vocabulary that's used in the scriptures are very different, definitely, right? But I think a lot of the original sentiment is still there. That's what gives me confidence in something in these stories, is because of this validity and documentation, that after so many years, people can still agree that yes, in fact, these things happened. Right? You also have to think about too, like when these books were all coming together to create this Bible, how many books didn't make the cut? This is almost like a filtered, condensed down version of other books that were not included, right? And you have to think about, like, you know, if you were an official back in the day trying to scrutinize, okay, how do we evaluate what books to include in this Bible and what to leave out? Well, then there's a lot of books that probably were left out due to the fact that they were either they were either too vague, or some of the information that was documented was not valid enough. Maybe there were not enough verifiers, or maybe there weren't enough eyewitnesses, that some of the books that were left out were probably the officials didn't feel like they were confident in including that. You know, so that's why the books that did remain in the Bible, I have even more confidence to, you know, because of that reason. It's like they've passed the test of that validity. They've passed that validity test. I want to also talk about like eyewitnesses too, because, you know, eyewitnesses are everything. Like a police report or some kind of like crime scene, an eyewitness is one of, if not the best source of information. When you have eyewitnesses telling information, not only should it be taken very seriously, but the fact that you can have multiple eyewitnesses that were corroborated, that were not in communication and had to tell the same thing, gives you so much confidence. Yeah, man, I just want to talk about documentation in this one. If you liked it, throw me a like, follow. I'm going to keep recording in this car anyway, so I'll see you guys in the next video here in just a second. So, peace.